Dear colleagues, we start our new webinar from the Innovative Universities series, and we travel today not far from our previous stop from Mexico to Texas. In fact, we received a lot of messages from people who watch our recordings or who read our article in University World News that we need to visit University of Austin because it's another interesting and brave innovation. So before we go to the discussion about this university, let me remind the rules of our webinar. We work exactly 60 minutes. We have approximately 15-25 minutes presentation and then discussion. You can ask questions. We prefer it would be better if you ask questions through question and answer button, but you also can use a chat. The seminar is live, but we do have recordings that are available on YouTube. And I'm grateful to our steering committee, it's here on the slide, for their support and recommendations. And let me introduce my co-host, Dara, who will introduce then our today's guest. Dara, please. Dara, you are muted.
Dear everyone, hello. I'm happy to see you here as usual. Also, hello to our listeners later on YouTube. So today, as Isak has said, we are talking about the University of Austin, a place where, to quote our speaker's article, intellectual dissent is protected and fashionable opinions are scrutinized. It's also the place that aims to restore, again, I'm quoting, the meaning of old school mottos, which couldn't be a loftier but yet worthier pursuit. And now we would guess that to do so, one would simply need to return to the first principles, but in the current organizational landscape, that itself requires innovation. And Pano, I think, is exceptionally well positioned to talk about this because previously, prior to becoming the president of the University of Austin, he used to be the president of St. John's College, which, to our speakers who are not familiar with the institution, is a very curious college itself. It's built on great books only. It's very rigorous in that sense. It did introduce this as innovation in the closer to the first half of the 20th century. And it has been going strong since then. So it's a very classic institution, which Pano abandoned to join the University of Austin. And we are very much hoping to learn why. Pano, the floor is yours.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for the opportunity to have this discussion today. I found your opening video very inspirational and saw many familiar faces on there. There's so many wonderful projects that are underway in the world today, and it's exciting to be one of those projects. In fact, we are America's newest university. And so what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is just kind of run through let's say the foundational principles and motivations for starting the University of Austin. And I look forward to the conversation that's going to emerge from that. This is, by the way, this is our downtown campus. This is where we're located here in the center of Austin, the building. So our goal is to renew the promise of higher education. And our motto is the fearless pursuit of truth. We believe that is the core responsibility of universities, to pursue truth and to do so courageously. We're an institution committed to intellectual freedom, meritocracy, institutional neutrality, and the Republic's founding principles of individual liberty and the rule of law. Right, these are our values. And our goal is to be competitive with, but fundamentally distinct from existing elite institutions by the end of this decade. I know that's an audacious goal. Maybe at the end of my presentation, you'll believe we can achieve that goal. Maybe you'll tell me we're foolish, but that is our goal. And we believe that the reinvention of the university is indispensable if our civilization is to be preserved and advanced. America's founded great universities in the past. The University of Virginia was founded in 1819, designed by Thomas Jefferson. University of Chicago, which is my alma mater, began in 1894. And these sorts of institutions were the seedbed for what I would call the American century of higher education. Americans laid the groundwork in the 19th century to create a network of universities that at this point in our history is unsurpassed. It may not always be unsurpassed. In the 19th century, 40 or so of the world's great universities were in Germany. And the 21st century will probably see a global distribution of elite institutions. But for now, America has been leading the way. So as I said, there was a sort of gilded age. We saw Vanderbilt, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, Chicago, and other institutions take shape when the German model of a research university was melded with the American model of the liberal arts college. And these new universities grew at a very rapid pace. University of Chicago in its opening class had a couple hundred students, but within a couple decades, it was a dominant institution with almost 3,000 students, a third of whom were graduate students. In starting the University of Chicago, William Rainey Harper, who was the first president, really was setting out to reinvent the university itself. He created things that universities hadn't hitherto had, things like university presses, extension schools, so education that would go beyond undergraduate and graduate education. He created the quarter system, which is relatively common in US institutions now. Business schools and law schools up to that point were really not embedded within universities. They had been independent institutions. And most importantly, he established a bedrock standard of academic freedom as being essential to the work of universities. So we saw that, just over a century ago, 130-ish years ago, that a single university can transform both the form and content of education. But in our era today of rapid economic growth, almost no universities have been founded. And I'm speaking specifically in an American context. I know there's been great growth of universities across the globe. In the US, of the top 25 universities that we have today, 10 were founded between 1855 and 1900. The others were founded earlier. Only a handful of universities have been founded since the year 1900. And most of these are relatively small or regional universities. In the founder, the benefactor of the University of Chicago was, of course, Rockefeller. And at that time, it was, the great, let's say, the high and mighty, the wealthy, the great figures in society committed themselves to founding new institutions. This was what allowed US institutions to be founded. But the Rockefellers of our day are giving to established institutions. So we see the primary flow of philanthropic funding going back to schools that already have billions and billions of dollars in endowments. Yet those very institutions that they're supporting are seen to be increasingly hostile to the principles of a free society. I just did an event last night with an organization called FIRE, the Foundation for, I'm going to forget the exact acronym, but it's the primary organization that supports academic freedom and free speech in the United States. We did a joint panel last night, and they do a ranking of all US institutions, all universities. And at the very, very bottom of the list, number 254 was Harvard University. In fact, Harvard University received, for the first time ever, an actual negative score on their scale. So we're seeing that the great institutions are increasingly hostile to the principles of a free society. Yeah, universities really do matter, as Hayek said. Nowhere is freedom more important than where our ignorance is greatest at the boundaries of knowledge. In other words, where nobody can predict what lies a step ahead. So the ability to have institutions where we do our thinking, where we come together as in an environment of intellectual pluralism, where ideas can be exchanged, where ideas can be tested. This is, not only is this the bedrock of education, it's the bedrock of a free society. But universities today have become increasingly hostile to freedom of speech. And again, I'm speaking about an American context here. Whether or not this applies in the global context is something that I'm less familiar with and would love to learn more about. But just for example, here's a chart that speaks about deplatforming. That is the number of attempts where speakers have been disinvited, performances canceled, art exhibits taken down, et cetera, across universities. We see in 2023, there were at least 137 major reported incidents of limitations, deplatforming around freedom of speech. And we know that cancel culture in many ways has made a mockery of academic freedom itself. So tenure was meant to protect academic freedom over time, yet we see prominent professors at prominent institutions who are stripped of their tenure for reasons that have very little to do with the intellectual content of their work. Also troublingly, almost 60% of students say that they are reluctant to discuss in a university setting at least one of 5 controversial topics. In other words, students are self-censoring. They're worried that other students will judge them, that their professors may judge them, that they may lose their position at the institution that they're part of. And as you look across the elite institutions, from Princeton to Chicago to Harvard, you find that the apprehension that students and faculty have about being able to speak freely is pretty consistent. In fact, the more elite an institution we find, the more extreme seems to be their limitations on speech. And there's that chart, I talked about the FIRE chart there that ranks from 100, I guess it's the 248, I thought it was 254. And you see that many of the institutions that are at the very bottom of the list, in other words, those that are judged to be less free in terms of free speech activity on campuses, University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League school, Dartmouth College, Harvard University, Yale University, Princeton, Stanford, are all near the bottom. And this has consequences beyond universities themselves, because if universities are not the crucibles for, let's say, liberal tolerance, for openness, for the exchange of ideas, if universities themselves, especially elite universities, become places that are trending towards illiberalism, we'll see that illiberalism spread over into society itself, primarily through the production of elites who are leading the way. And we see that elites and elite institutions are increasingly estranged from ordinary Americans. So if you look at the way people vote, the way they think about important public issues, that those who are either faculty or graduates of elite institutions see the world radically different than most of the rest of the population in this country. Even worse, once you give up the notion that ideas are meant to be contested, that orthodoxies are meant to be challenged in the setting of a university, we see that even science itself, which is ostensibly empirical, ostensibly trying to work towards, methodically towards verifiable truths, once we see that politics and ideology start to bleed into universities, they bleed into science as well. So this was our sort of inspirational quote that we took from Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff when we first started: a school that makes freedom of inquiry an essential part of its identity, selects students who show special promise as seekers of truth, orients and prepares those students for productive disagreement. Such a school would be inspiring to join, a joy to attend, and a blessing to society. So we've been working on starting this university for the past 3 years. In the fall of 2021, I published a sort of manifesto along with some of my other founders, that said, we're done waiting for legacy universities to write themselves. We are going to build anew. We decided that in the same way that, a century and a quarter ago, where we saw the flourishing of new institutions that renewed the promise of higher education into the 20th century, it was time for us to create new institutions now that would carry that into the 21st century and beyond. We conceived of the university in May 21. We promised at that time that within 3 years, we would have our very first cohort of undergraduate students join us. And I'm excited to say that 3 weeks ago, we began operating as a university with our very first class of freshmen, almost 3 years to the day after the first announcement that we made in November of 2021. So this is our attempt to follow in Jefferson's footsteps and Harper's footsteps to create institutions that can lead the way. In fact, you'll see that's the shield of the University of Austin, and our symbol on that shield is the North Star, Polaris. How do we provide a North Star for universities to follow? And we're doing this by appealing to high school seniors who are fed up with self-censorship and who aspire to build. We are building an institution to graduate the next generation of builders and creators and innovators and entrepreneurs. And we've built it, and they're coming. These are a picture of students from our very first cohort of students, and this is in the atrium of our university. Remarkably, we've been able to attract students from all over the US and students from across the world, even though we're a brand new university with, just getting started. And the students we've attracted have been immensely enthusiastic and high achieving and committed to our cause. These are some of the quotes from our students so far that, they said there aren't a lot of spaces where you can feel in the world in general comfortable being uncomfortable. They say everyone wants to be here, everyone wants to learn, everyone puts their phone away and is engaged. They say that people are open here, that it speaks to the mission of UATX, creating an environment that's open and prepared to encourage the exchange of ideas. So I've given you the sort of principles behind the university and the motivation behind what we're doing, but I'm very, very interested in just starting to dive into the weeds, because I know all of you are interested in how you take principles and put them into practice. And as a new university and one that's launched with a great degree of attention, I'm really excited to give you some of the inside perspective on what we've been doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Pano. Isaac, do you mind if I start?
Yes, please. I do also have questions, but please, yeah.
I no doubted that for a minute.
Yeah.
So Pano, I would like to begin with clarifying the target outcome. So not exactly the mission that you introduced, but the target outcome. On the website, I read quite a bit about the kind of students that the University of Austin is seeking to prepare. So if you could elaborate on that. So what kind of person should you receive as the result of the 4 year of schooling, and whether you also have other outcomes apart from students and influence on higher education institutions, whether you're thinking of introducing the research pillar as well, maybe innovation or something else. So what should be the result?
Sure. So yes, I mean, having just gone through our first admission cycle, we were thinking very carefully about the kinds of students that we wanted to bring into the institution and faculty. We've hired our first cohorts of faculty as well. And then, what the telos of the institution is. What are the outcomes we're seeking? I think at heart, universities are and always have been institutions dedicated to preparing graduates for, let's call it, the knowledge economy. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think this goes all the way back to at least the medieval foundations of European institutions. If the knowledge economy is defined as work that is primarily intellectual in nature, when we see the origins of places like Oxford and Cambridge and University of Paris and Bologna, there were very few professions that we would have qualified back then as being part of the knowledge economy. In fact, they were law, medicine, and theology. And so those were the areas of focus in the early universities. And throughout the history of universities, at least in a Western context, universities have sort of mostly sat askew from society because most of the labor that people have done has been outside the knowledge economy. The great builders of the 19th century, the great entrepreneurs, the inventors, and that didn't need to go to university to learn a craft, right? They just did the things that needed to be done. But in the 20th century, as we've sort of shifted towards an increasingly knowledge-based economy, universities play now an outsized role in, let's say, the flourishing of society, the flourishing of culture, the flourishing of nations. So the way that we think about this is, how are we preparing young people to do work that is primarily intellectual in nature, that will lead to both their own flourishing and the flourishing of society? And one of the things that we've concluded is that university education should be much less about content and more about developing, let's say, the critical apparatus that a young person has, the ability to think, to solve problems, to work together towards ever nuanced and increasingly complex solutions. What one studies, especially as an undergraduate, almost doesn't matter. Whether you're studying anthropology or poetry or engineering, what's really being developed is the muscle of the mind. And to develop that muscle, like all muscles, you need tension, you need strain, you need to push against the very sort of the thing that you're trying to develop. So our mode of education is to take very complex intellectual ideas, intellectual material, create a very rigorous academic curriculum, and train young people so that when they leave us, whether they're going to be a banker or a diplomat, or an artist, what they've learned along the way is essentially how to I don't know if this reference will be meaningful to everybody, but you remember in the 80s we had that game of Rubik's Cube where you had to sort of solve it.
Yes.
How do you solve the Rubik's Cube of life? How do you make everything line up? So that's how we conceive of the education that we're offering.
Dara, may I clarify one thing? And it's I don't want to sound provocative, but what you said, I would interpret like you train intellectual muscles, and yeah, it's through deep intellectual discussion, understanding, analysis of problems. However, in the New Republic recently in June, the title of the article about your university was Anti-Woke University. So I understand that you are not responsible for the titles, but it's a bit different, yeah, because the author thinks that you are also ideological, just from another on another side of the ideology. So what is correct perception? Yeah.
So when we first announced the university 3 years ago, we're living in a cultural moment where everybody wants to place every person, every institution on an ideological spectrum. It's almost compulsive to do this. And because when we first announced what we were doing, we're dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth, that we want to create a community of open inquiry, and that we were implicitly and maybe even explicitly critiquing, let's say, the state of academic freedom at existing US universities. And this was taken by some to be a critique of the fact that universities are massively dominated by people on the left end of the political spectrum. And so if we're critiquing these institutions are left-leaning in their orientation, then this must be some sort of right-leaning response to that.
Yep.
And what I've said many times is that, politics should be studied at a university. It shouldn't be the operating system of a university. The fact that American universities are politically asymmetrical is a problem. It would be the same problem if you created a university on the right. All right. You have to support intellectual pluralism. You have to support the sort of classical principles of, tolerance and open-mindedness. You have to transcend the political binary. So our goal is not to create a politically or ideologically oriented university. It's to fulfill the promise of university education itself, which is to be a place of conjunction between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. It's a place where you study received ideas, challenge those ideas. One way I would describe it is the job of universities are to stir up all the settled ideas and then see when they settle back down if they still have the same shape. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. All right. None of this is ideological, right? This is purpose-driven in terms of how we understand that the function of a university is primarily the discovery of knowledge, the transmission of knowledge and the preservation of knowledge. If that's what these institutions are built for, what are the conditions that will allow for the fulfilling of that mission? Anti-woke, I don't even know what that means. I never use the word woke. To me, that's a silly term. 20 years from now, people are going to have to go and whatever Google we have at the time are going to have to look it up and see what it means. You don't build an institution to be against things. You build an institution to be for things. So, there was some, let's say knee-jerk politicized responses to what we set out to do. I will say that's almost entirely faded. I mean, the media that covers us now doesn't cover us in that same way. I think as we've sort of lived into our promise, those particular issues have sort of faded from the attention of the media.
Thank you.
So I want to go to the beginning, to the initial question of outputs, and kind of flip it and ask you about inputs now. So you've just talked about heterodoxy, which I assume presupposes diversity of primarily perspectives. And the question is, how do you ensure that students have that? And as a kind of a build on that question, are you open to international students? Are you seeking them actively to add more diversity, or for the time being, it's not a part of your admissions policy?
Yeah, I'll take that part first. We are eager to bring international students in our community. It will take a year or two before we have authorization from the US government to offer F1 visas. So that's a process we're undertaking now. We have some international students, but they are all limited so far to students who have dual citizenship, so that it's not an issue. So within 2 to 3 years, I think we'll be very actively recruiting international students. Let me reframe that question, the diversity of thought question. I mean, yes, I think, and I prefer the term intellectual pluralism to diversity of thought for reasons we can get into, but what you should not be building as let's say community committed to truth seeking is a kind of menagerie, a grouping of lots of people who have very strong opinions, very tightly held, who differ from one another, right? What you should be seeking to build are a community of people who have opinions lightly held. In other words, who are coming to an institution not to assert their beliefs and assert their ideas and try to win or debate over others, but who are coming from a posture of intellectual humility. In other words, saying like, there are things we know about the world, there are things I think I know, I'm going to university actually to learn what I don't yet know, or to test the things that I do hold. And so what we're seeking for is less a set of, here's 20 different perspectives, but 20 different people who are fundamentally committed to truth seeking and who are open, who are willing to listen before they speak. One of our principles in the classroom is that every opinion must be heard, but every opinion must also be backed up by evidence. So this is not just a place to share opinions. In fact, I resolutely opposed the idea that debate is an important part of higher education, because debate presupposes two fixed positions, each trying to outdo the other. For me, dialogue should be the way that universities approach discussion and intellectual questions. How do we get together? One opinion plus another opinion shouldn't leave us with two opinions. It should lead us with better opinions. So I'm flipping that around and saying it's less, we don't need 3 socialists, 1 communist, 4 libertarians, and this or that. What we want are people who are going to come in from different backgrounds, different perspectives, and leave transformed in fundamental ways.
So I want to ask a bit of a follow-up question, because I feel it's very important. It's a very important part of the discussion. I recently read Tim Urban's book, What's Our Problem? It's quite a brilliant piece, which also has a part on colleges, and he divides society thinking patterns into echo chambers and idea labs. One of the observations that he cites, he doesn't make it, but he cites the research that does come to that conclusion, that if people who think similarly come together, their opinions become more and more synced over time, and they start drawing people who also think similarly. Even if initially that similarity was, to quote you, opinions lightly held, there is still a chance that it will twist and turn and end up being something completely opposite. What provisions do you make in your curriculum, apart from every opinion should be heard, which I feel is not sufficient, because what if opinions become similar? What if your message draws particular people in?
Yeah.
What provisions do you make for that not to happen?
So, by the way, Tim Urban was a guest speaker here over the summer, and he's here in Austin. He's a great thinker. Yeah, look, you can the problem in higher education is we have created ideological echo chambers. So how do you ensure that you're not replicating that problem? Part of it is setting the norms and standards that incentivize questioning over making assertions. And you do this through creating a culture of dialogue and civil discourse. So you have to just think very carefully about what are those practices and how do you employ them. Another part of it is structural. So we've created a curriculum. The first 2 years are what we call the intellectual foundations curriculum, that purposefully, let's say, looks at, I would call it something like the genealogy of modernity. Like, how did we get from chaos to civilization to modernity? And presents primarily through the study of great books and works of art and foundations of science, the multiplicity of perspectives that have been in conversation with each other over time. So, when you're thinking about politics, I would think how many different, how prismatic a discussion of politics can be, helping students to sort of lift themselves out of the moment we live in, where everything feels rather two-dimensional, and understand the innumerable ways that society has organized itself over time. This is a way of promoting intellectual pluralism, right? So it's not just about the participants, it's about the content that you introduce, and then living with that content. Insisting, for example, exposing, for example, how historicist we have become. how locked in our own historical bubble we are right now, and shattering that bubble, helping students understand how rich and varied the life of the mind has been over time. It's a way for them to become self-reflective. And then when you become self-reflective, I think you create a kind of resistance or immunity, I would say, to ideology, because it's almost impossible. Ideology is to subscribe to a fixed set of ideas, a totalizing set of ideas that explain the entire world. As you learn more and more about how varied, nuanced, complex the human experience has been over time, the more resistant you become to ideological fixation. And so for me, the purpose, again, is not to create a community that, sort of proportionally represents the political positions that we currently hold today. It's to create learners and intellectual inquirers who see beyond that and above that. And that's how you'll create a generation that will help us think past the kind of impasses that we currently experience.
The problem here, which you do cite on the website, is that pretty much every American university in top 400, so leading research universities and leading liberal arts colleges, claim to be doing exactly the same thing, especially institutions like the University of Chicago, let's say. And yet you have one of the former presidents of the University of Chicago among your extended team. So there is something that you're doing that is fundamentally different from what they're doing at a model level. And I'm still trying to capture it. So
okay, let me dive a little deeper then.
Yes.
Thank you for these questions, because fundamentally, again, let's call it the sort of protections around the principles that we are committed to are critical. I mean, and so we've been thinking about this, and from the very earliest conception of the university, how do we protect the mission over time? So I'm actually writing an op-ed on this right now. I'm invited by college presidents, boards of trustees across the country to universities to talk to them about what we're doing, because they recognize in the University of Austin a place that actually is living up to the principles of academic freedom and truth-seeking. So why is that the case? It's because what we recognize is there are three things that you have to do to protect academic freedom, intellectual pluralism, and civil discourse. The first is you have to constantly assess whether or not you're upholding your mission. So do you build into your structure the means for assessing over time if you're adhering to your mission? And ways to do that, for example, are every spring we hold what we call the First Principles Summit. And we get our faculty and staff together, and then we invite people from other universities and public intellectuals, and we have a weekend together, and we review the past year at the University of Austin. And we talk about the things that seem to have gone right, where we might have made mistakes. We receive feedback and criticism from people outside, and then we adjust. So again, if you go through an annual evaluative process like this, it keeps you, let's say, more on target, or makes you more responsible. Another way to assess things is to, when your students come in, you do a kind of entry survey and ask them their opinions about a variety of topics. And then when they exit, you do another survey to see, have their ideas developed or changed over time? So if one of the things that you're trying to achieve is to a kind of spiritedness of openness, then you should see over time that your students are changing their opinions, that, or developing them more deeply or whatever. And so you mark that. So assessing is very important. I think another component upon this is creating an institution of, I would say, perpetual self-reflection. So the institution goes through a process of assessing how we're upholding our mission. but you have a kind of a set of, let's say, events throughout the year where students and faculty come together and we talk about our first principles. We talk about what's important in higher education. We talk about what truth-seeking is. And we reflect as personally whether or not we are living up as individuals to the standards that the institution purports to hold. So it's that sort of personal self-reflection. And then the third part is, I would say, creating a governance structure that holds you accountable. And so I'll give one example of that here. The University of Austin was founded with a constitution. We call it our Constitution, and it's modeled on the US Constitution. And the US Constitution has been so stable over time because it separates powers. It recognizes different functions. So there's a legislative branch that makes the laws, an executive branch that carries out the laws, and then a judiciary branch that ensures that the Constitution itself is honored, the principles of the Constitution. So as a university, we realized we have an executive branch, the people who run the university, who carry out the mission. We have a legislative branch, the founders, the founding documents, the faculty senate, the board of trustees that create the rules, that we needed a judiciary branch, a Supreme Court. Now, no other institution has this. The University of Chicago doesn't, nobody does. Our judiciary branch, we call it the adjudicative panel, is a group of people, constitutional scholars, academics, and intellectuals who sit outside the university, who are not employees of the university, who are not teachers at the university, but who are autonomous and independent and who volunteer for service, who act as our Supreme Court. So if somebody at the university has an issue around, let's say, academic freedom, they feel it's a professor, and they feel like their research has been limited by a dean or by the institution, they can ultimately appeal to this independent body, this Supreme Court, and the judgment of that Supreme Court, again, which sees everything through our constitutional lens, is binding upon the university. So having a mechanism to hold yourself accountable to your mission is key. And I think this particular innovation is one that other institutions in the United States are already becoming very sort of interested in adopting. So I'm hoping that this will be more widely deployed.
Okay, so ingraciously stepping onto Isaac's time with you here. Just one small clarification. So one of the provisions that universities have historically been making, supposedly, to protect academic freedom has been tenure. You're doing away with that. Why so, and how do you protect your faculty from being fired for thinking differently or from being attacked? Is that in the Constitution?
So yeah, and remember, tenure is a very American phenomenon. I mean, most universities across the world don't have tenure. So to take the first part of that question, the last part first, that's the purpose of the Constitution, right? So you have constitutional protections that ensure academic freedom. So if a professor felt that their right to academic freedom is violated, they don't seek recourse within the institution. They have an independent body that adjudicates. If you seek it within the institution, as we find in many cases, the institution is self-interested and isn't always, who's going to watch the watchman is, the question at hand. And institutions can't be self-policing. So the Constitution provides that. The main reason to get rid of tenure is what we've seen in the American context is the process of tenure has led to an ideological monoculture, because tenure empowers professors to hire, evaluate, and tenure their colleagues. And so in a highly competitive job market, every time there's a professorship that's open, you have hundreds of people applying. The tenured professors look at those applicants and they select among the candidates who they're going to bring on as their colleagues. The natural propensity towards selecting people that you agree with is it's almost unavoidable. And so, you hire people who you're comfortable with, who tend to agree with you. And then you have 6 or 7 years before they're tenured to see if in fact, whether they actually do agree with you. And so during, I was a tenured professor. During that 6 to 7 year period, you have the opposite of academic freedom. As a young faculty member, you're always worried about what the senior faculty are thinking about you and your work. You are constantly doing work and teaching, not in the spirit of, heterodoxy and exploration and openness, but with this guillotine over your head that if you step out of line, you're going to lose your job. And by that point in the tenure system, if you're not tenured and you've been 6 or 7 years in an institution, most people become unemployable. So the threat of not becoming tenured depresses academic freedom. So, for us, building academic freedom into the Constitution itself was the solution to that problem.
So the problem, to paraphrase, is not tenure, it's tenure track and the way it is practiced.
It's the problem, right? The problem is the process of hiring and tenuring. I also think if you're ensuring academic freedom for somebody over the course of their whole career, then tenure is redundant. What do you need tenure for? You should, I'll give you the University of Florida. Recently, all public universities in the state of Florida were mandated by the state legislature to now review all tenured faculty and go through this kind of rigorous review of their teaching and their scholarship, and then put them on a kind of ranking scale. And those who perform very low on that scale potentially could lose their tenure. So they've gone through one cycle of this. And what they discovered was it was something like 1/4 to 1/3 of the tenured faculty who went through this process did not meet the minimum standards for quality. In other words, their teaching was so bad, or their scholarship was non-existent, or they weren't involved as service in that. They literally failed their obligations as a professor because they had the protection of tenure. So if you're tenuring people and 1/3 of them are, let's say, acting in bad faith, yet you have no recourse to do anything about that, that is a price borne by the students and by the institution and by the system at large. So I think, I think tenure can have unintended consequences that are really deleterious.
I see it, Isak, I see it.
No. That's very important, because I guess that, again, I asked similar question, but I want to ask again similar question, but in a more practical way. As I understand, again, from our discussion and from I read, the issue of freedom is in academic freedom is kind of secondary. Let me put it more provocative. The real issue and real task is academic obligation to seek the truth and but we know that this task requires some skills. I do see that at the time when some well-established university abandoned grade books curriculum, you introduce it, and yeah, that's becoming innovation again, like 100 years ago. But what else in the curriculum you use to train people? I specifically use this word, train people to seek the truth, to look in the roots of the problems, to understand the complexity, etc.
Yeah.
My friends from Oxford University recently told me that they don't even require from students, even from PhD students, sometimes publications, but they have to demonstrate this reflective, well-founded judgment. And they train it, from master to apprentice. How do you do that?
Yes. So I think that the end point of truth seeking for human beings is the cultivation of wisdom. Let's call it practical prudence, the ability to make better decisions, better judgments. And to achieve that, I think a university has to combine both the theoretical and the practical. In other words, we could spend 4 years, and this is what we did at St. John's, reading books and talking about ideas. But unless you put ideas in the pressure cooker of pragmatic empirical reality, you ultimately can't develop practical wisdom, prudentia. So for us, we have a very, I think, innovative and distinctive curriculum, and I'll run through it very quickly and to answer your question. But for the first 2 years, this Intellectual Foundations program is very much a kind of great books, liberal arts focused program. It's around concepts and ideas. It's thinking about things philosophically, theoretically, and it's primarily a discussion-based experience. In the latter part of, we have a 4-year undergraduate experience here in the US. In the latter 2 years, students move into one of our centers of inquiry, and we have centers of inquiry around in areas of humanities, social sciences, STEM. And in these centers, rather than the traditional academic department where you have scholars who, do scholarship and create majors and all that, our centers are more like think tanks or research centers populated by both traditional scholars, but also practitioners, people who are building rocket ships or, working in politics and that. And the centers themselves are engaged in finding solutions to questions in the world. And students become junior fellows at one of these centers. So they become part of, let's say, a problem-solving community, and then engage in this problem solving with scholars and practitioners. So those are like the two, let's say, consecutive parts of our curriculum, but there's a third part, and this is very important. I said that our symbol is Polaris, the North Star, that in order to seek truth, you have to have some directionality. You have to have know where to aim your efforts. Every single student at the University of Austin engages across all 4 years that they're with us in what we call their Polaris project. And the Polaris project is a project in which it's a moonshot project in which they identify a significant human need or problem, and they have to come up with a solution to that problem. And we start at the very beginning in the first year with a kind of, let's call it, vocational or personal exploration, like helping them understand, like, what are your greatest gifts? What are your skills? And how do you bring those to the world's greatest needs? And then from this reflective process, they hone an ever more practical question. And then they have to find a way to come up with a plan to execute on to try and solve that problem. And I'll give you an example to make this concrete. This is the one I use most often, but I love it. So one of the students that I was talking to who was applying to the university, I was having a conversation with him, and I said, so have you thought about a Polaris project? Do you have an idea what you might want to do? And he said, I love physics. I love nuclear energy. And I've been reading about the US Navy and how the US Navy's, the ships now are all nuclear powered. And yet they decommission these ships that have these nuclear cores after a couple decades with, decades of nuclear energy still latent inside their nuclear cores. And it's just sitting there. He said, what if we could find a way to tap into that existing latent nuclear energy to power seaport industry or seaport towns or that? Like, could we do that? That's a question. And so this young man is going to set about figuring out, is that a possibility? And if you think about it, solving that kind of question, it's not just a technical question. It's an economic question. It's a political question. It's a logistical question. And so a complete education centered around a significant problem like that helps that student hone their, let's say, their not just their theoretical skills, but their problem solving skills, their pragmatic skills of acting in the world. Now, at the end of 4 years, maybe the student has solved the problem, maybe they haven't. The most important thing is what they've learned along the way about how you come up with ideas and solutions is critical. I say all the time that we live in a world where institutions are falling apart, trust in institutions is shattered, where people are moving farther apart. Everything seems to be collapsing. In a world like that, the only thing to do is to build anew, to create new things, create new institutions. That's what we're doing. We're building a new institution, and the purpose of our institution is to create the next generation of builders and creators and innovators.
Okay.
So that's how I would answer that.
Yeah, thank you. That's practical response. Dara, your last question and my last question. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so we do have a question from the audience. I will try to raise the stakes for that question a little bit, just because we don't have much time. So the question is whether you are planning to partner up with other institutions, but raising the stakes. So normally universities partner to increase the scope. And I'll phrase this wider. How are you planning to increase the scope of the University of Austin? What are some of the ways that you're considering now?
Yeah. Yeah, we're already we already have collaborations underway, both with other educational institutions and with industry. I'll give a couple examples. A significant problem in the United States is the financial model of higher education. The cost structure has gone out of control. And this is mostly because of the operating costs, the administrative cost of higher education. So in trying to make our university more accessible and affordable, we decided to lower administrative costs by partnering with a university in Guatemala to create, in partnership with them, a virtual administrative hub that will allow remote virtual administrative services to supply our university. This reduces the cost by about 80%. And it creates—
How many percent?
80%. It costs about 20% to employ an administrator there. So that's one practical thing. Another partnership we're working on with industry, the company will remain unnamed, but you may be able to read between the lines. We have a lot of interest in our faculty and students here in aerospace technology and aerospace engineering. And so we're partnering with a company that's here in Austin building rocket ships and actually building a research center adjacent to their headquarters so that our students can engage in what we call immersive experiential learning. So they're actually working hand in hand with the people who are modeling the kind of things that they need to learn. So those are the kind of collaborations that we're involved in.
Thank you. And it's fascinating discussion, but we have no time. And our traditional last question, I will put it like that. When you presented experience of University of Chicago, and you mentioned a few very interesting ideas, very concrete ideas, like that Harper suggested, summer semester for quarters, business school, just business school. What you already said, very practical thing about your curriculum, Polaris project, and junior inquiry. It's very interesting fellowship. Super idea. What other few practical ideas would you recommend to universities that aim to develop high order, let me use very traditional terminology, high order thinking skills and search for truth? What practical things would you recommend?
So I'm going to suggest something that's going to sound very radical and maybe impractical, but why not? Maybe I am a dreamer, not. I think that universities should not charge tuition for their undergraduate students, but should rely on their graduates to pay back to the institution once they've achieved success, what they think, a percentage of what they think the university is responsible for in their success. Because what that does is it aligns the incentives of the university with the outcomes of the students. If you're depending upon your students to become successful for your own survival as an institution, you are going to ensure that a great many of them do become successful. And so in our case, for example, where our first class of students, we're not charging any tuition, but we've created a talent network of companies and organizations and all across different industries and areas that are already signing up to intern, apprentice, and hire our students. Why have we gone to such great length? With 3 times as many positions for our students to occupy than we currently have students. Why are we going to great length? Because their success ensures our success. So building a model, maybe it's not tuition free entirely, but building a model that aligns the outcomes of students with the success of the institution is critical. Right now, the outcome for most students is they come, they pay you tuition for 4 years, and you give them a certificate and wish them good luck. What if your future was dependent upon their future? That's what I'd like to keep exploring.
Thank you very much. And as usual, but this time especially, we didn't have enough time for the discussion.
Thank you.
And we're looking forward to further conversations. And again, many universities around the world think about thinking skills, and your experience again is very interesting.